Okay, let's get it. On to the Morgan Day interview. We may skip around. I don't know anything about the starting zone. I think I have seen one interview from them in the past, but it was a long time ago. I don't know what they... Oh, no. Dude, okay. If I remember properly, I think these guys did a really good interview at one point. Like, it was really good.
Much for joining us, Morgan. We're very excited to be here talking about Dragonflight Alpha, which we've had to be a little hush-hush about for the last 24 hours because we were under NDA, but we get to actually talk about it now with you. It's super exciting.
That's awesome.
To start off, I mean, this is... So there's so much coming in this, but probably the first thing players are going to experience that's going to kind of knock them on their heels a little bit is the talent system and all of the new talents that are coming in, how things are being juggled and shifted up. I guess a lot of this is, it's a large shift for players because they're going to be losing some combinations of abilities they've always had, but they're also going to be gaining some cool stuff that you've borrowed from other systems into the talent tree. So what's sort of the hope for how players are going to interact with this new talent system?
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of our initial goals when we were talking about revamping the talent system was to add build diversity, right? Like add options to people. Like you mentioned, sometimes there might be a thing that they were used to kind of having, quote unquote, for free, but really looking at my class and my spec as an opportunity to kind of build what I want my identity of my character to be and more clearly hyper specialize into certain things and add more options there is a major goal of ours. So, how do people interact with it? I imagine that'll be different based on who you are and what type of player you are. But that's very much an early goal of ours.
Wait, I need to. You guys said close the launcher and update. I don't have any updates for Dragonflight Alpha. Does anyone, is it 10.0.0.44649? Does anyone have a higher one than that? Also, let's go ahead and just turn this down just a little bit to a reasonable level. And then we'll just like keep this like, like this.
To kind of harken back almost to that like Burning Crusade era of being able to almost specialize as like a support character where, maybe you're a shaman who has a couple more, abilities to support out and heal and do more off healing as a shaman versus some other spec that another shaman in your raid might be doing. So wanting to add a lot more identity there for sure.
Is the objective still with them to have the last sort of talents in each of the trees, so your specialization tree and your class tree, be like those really hot, attractive, everyone's kind of wanting to get to them talents? Or do you foresee builds being ones where people actually don't even go after those, but they just sort of spread themselves out width-wise across the tree to sort of, specialize a certain way?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I will be curious to see what players do once they get it into their hands. I know we've been putting out the talent previews even earlier than the alpha was up in no small part to see what people did with the talent trees once they were kind of out in the wild and see what kind of builds people could come up with. That was one of the things we always talk about and miss, just playing around with like a talent calculator or something and messing around with different builds and then coming home from work and being like, all right, I want to check this build out in PvP tonight, or I want to try this Mythic Plus build tonight in this specific dungeon. That's very much an area where we're excited to see what people kind of come up with. And in terms of tuning, what people are seeing right now, it's, alpha isn't even out to the public yet. It is very roughed in numbers. I'm sure people already are running sims, figuring out what the best builds are, but there's a lot of tuning that still needs to be done. And it wouldn't surprise me at all if there were builds where people didn't go to the bottom, but maybe branched out a bit more in the deeper sections, but not all the way to the bottom. So lots of, hopefully lots of viable options there.
Yeah.
Now, you bring up an important word there, viable.
Yes.
That's a word that I like to use in my personal experience as a prot warrior main for life. The concept of viability comes up right in community conversations. But one of the problems, or maybe like one of the potential pitfalls of the old talent tree system as we knew it, was there were potential traps, that players could fall into if they miss certain important abilities, on their way down, or they kind of spread themselves too thin and they miss key factors that allow them to do their job. Can you talk a bit about coming back to a wider, a broader, deeper tree system after all these years. How do you avoid, potentially presenting these pitfalls to players? Or what about things like, I mean, obviously we have very rough trees right now, but what about things where you can pick an ability in a spec tree that modifies an ability that you didn't pick in your class tree, things like that?
Yeah, totally. So that specific instance that you're talking about there, that's actually a topic we've been discussing a lot since that's been.
I'm really glad. Yeah, we brought this up a ton in our things where, like, the main issue with talent trees, for sure, the problems that have existed with them so far, because they're all going to have varying different amounts of, like, decisions you make just by the nature of how they're made. But you never want to take a talent that you have to take that doesn't interact with the talent you want. So that's AoE versus single target. That's like some interaction versus another interaction. That should always be avoided. And they've had that happen and then moved away from it in the trees. Like, perfect example is the change they made to the Hunter tree. So that exists in the game. They've done better with that. But also there are some, like, nodes you have to take to amplify abilities you don't even pick. And that's weird.
A hot topic in the community about, like, well, there's talent in my spec tree that modifies ability in my class tree. What if I didn't take it? Like, that's literally a dead talent at that point? That seems weird. So that's very much a thing that we're talking about adjusting. But actually, just now talking about my class tree versus my spec tree, that's actually a big part of what we felt. We originally started out when we were developing the talent tree as, closer to a classic talent tree. It was just one big tree. And a kind of huge aha moment for us was when we were like, well, what if we actually had two trees and two types of talent points, where we're awarding you one that can go in this tree and another that can go in this tree. And for me, that kind of broke my brain for a minute, because I was like, I can't think of too many games that do that. Like, Path of Exile has your Ascension tree versus your normal tree, and, like, that was the closest example I could think of, and I was like, this is breaking my brain.
Oh, really?
But that was a really big kind of step for us, where we were talking about it from the perspective of, well,
I feel like this is definitely the best way they could have done it. I feel like having a class tree for the whole class and then a spec tree versus having every class having a massive spec tree, or every spec just having a massive spec tree, I think this is, like, absolutely better than that. So
we don't have to make you choose between, really awesome utility options and DPS throughput options, because that was an example where you might have come into or run into this before. So having those two different trees really helps to ensure that the floor for a player, your spending points in your spec tree, those are all going to be really throughput focused. The floor for that player, isn't going to get super low. Also, there's, a lot of fun options, or, a system of loadouts that we're actually developing for talents this time around, where previously people had only really had, like, dual spec, right? Or, your spec had a specific talent saved. But with Dragonflight, we're actually introducing loadouts where you're going to have quite a variety of options there. And of course, we've been talking about, like, potential features there where, like, hey, can I, like, share my loadout with other people so that they can, like, see mine and then load it into mine? So adding some social features there, where if you're like, hey, what should I be doing? I feel like I'm not doing it well enough. Somebody in your guild can be like, hey, here's my loadout, do this, right? I think those are all really cool tools that we didn't have before that should really be interesting to see how they play out.
Man, very, very cool. I like the idea of being able to share my spec with someone, or I'm picturing even in a community base where people are posting on the forums or posting, inside social media or discords, that kind of idea. This is my spec. This is what I'm doing for this dungeon. Or I'm sure Raider.io would get all over it with different people who are doing MDI stuff with different specs. So yeah, that's really neat. I like that concept a lot.
Yeah, and just being able to say, like, hey, this is my Mythic Plus raid. I made a note earlier about, like,
boys' shoulders are broad, Chad.
Mythic Plus often people like to talk about the big pulls, but on the content side of things, we always try to come at it from the perspective of, hey, we can have a dungeon where a 20 pull is a thing that could happen, but we also should be designing some of our dungeons where that's literally not possible. Like, maybe I always like to point out, dungeons like Theater of Pain is a great example most recently, where, like, yeah, that's just a dungeon full of big bruiser creatures that, you don't want to do giant pulls through large swaths of that dungeon. So really keeping an eye on how we're developing the content and making sure that that plays well with the systems.
Very cool. One last talent tree thing that I just wanted to check in on. When you guys are actually developing this, because I always like getting some insight around the development of it, does your team approach it from things like interrupts should be this far into the tree, and things like this
great fucking question
should be that far into the tree? Like, for class design, like, do you see that sort of similarity between a rogue design?
Yeah, but like on the mention, I was a little distracted, but like he just mentioned like where you can do big pulls but also dungeons that have smaller pulls. I think the Mythic Plus community like almost universally agrees that like shorter dungeons with bigger trash pulls and less bosses are like almost every single expansion are the best dungeons. They're never bad, they don't miss. So yeah, players don't actually really feel that way. Like, I'm pretty sure one of the best dungeons this expansion would be if you just did the beginning of Gambit all the way through the first boss, and then you stopped and just repeated it. Because big pulls own, and short dungeons own.
And a druid design and a priest design kind of idea?
Yeah, you keep hitting on the ones that are hot topics right now. Interrupts is an interesting one, right? Like, is there a world in which, you know, I get into a Mythic Plus dungeon and there's a rogue that doesn't have kick, right? Like, in what world would we be okay with that? So that's very much something we're talking about a lot right now. But in terms,
they've already handled this. We don't need to do like a whole dissertation on it, but every class that has a kick right now gets their kick basically for free, and it would be absurd if they didn't choose it. But if they ever didn't want to choose it, meaning your fight did not have an interrupt, right? If you're a Feral or Guardian Druid, right? You go down here, you grab these required points, okay? And then you grab your bark skin and Frenzy Regen. Now you can go through your whole tree, right? You can get everything you need to get, all right? You can get Wild Charge, you can get Tiger Dash, you can get the Absorb Bark Skin, you can get Soothe, you can get Stampeding Roar. You can do whatever you want. And then at that point, getting your kick is just a one-target thing. It's like if in a raid boss, if it doesn't have a kick, maybe you don't take it. And that gives you choice. But it's so easy to get, and you're not losing on anything by taking it, that you're probably going to take it all the time, if not just for a movement spell. But it's like you're not just going to like have people in your content trolling because they don't have kicks like that. It's just they haven't made the system that way. Frosty K is the same way. This was like people's biggest concern. Look at this. Mind Freeze IBF. There it is. You have an interrupt the whole expansion as a DK. Case closed. You'll never not take this. Or your personal, right? Rogues, they just made it fucking baseline. But like, yeah, they like just every class is going to deal with this differently. I would not worry about this at all. The kicks, people will have kicks. And even if they had the choice, they would take it in content. Like you're not just going to show up to a Mythic Plus dungeon without a kick, because you're not even usually choosing between offensive ability. You're choosing between like utility, and it's the best utility you can get. Just the high level
philosophy about how we approach the trees.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, I'm not sure if you had a chance to play around with it too much, but really high level, we're talking about just like things like how many points should be available before the first, I'm not sure, you know, the little lock symbol.
Yep.
Like internally, we kind of call them gates. Like there's a gate and you have to spend.
Yeah, that's a very good point, by the way. And I'm kind of interrupting him and on a tangent about something different. But like, you guys are saying like people in like low keys aren't going to kick. Guys, okay, look, if they talent a kick versus not talent a kick, they're not kicking anyway. It's like, what's the fucking difference? Like, who cares? Why do you care if someone has kick talented that would not have kicked in the first place? It doesn't. It's a net. Nothing changes. Net neutral.
So many points before the gate unlocks and you can move past it. So making sure that there are a specific number of total points, like how many points do I need to spend to get to one of those capper points or those capper talents that you were talking about. Really high level goals like that to make sure that we're being consistent across the specs there are a lot of what our discussions are about. But when it comes to, you know, what the individual tree is shaped like, things like that, you know, we talk about like Legion artifacts were really cool because they all were very different shapes. The way that they were structured were very different, and it worked out well there. But we want to make sure that there's consistency in terms of like, you know, the high level philosophy of what should be available with X points or Y points in each tree.
Yeah, I have played around with it a fair amount in the last 24 hours, and the one thing I ran into was Resto Druids having to spec into remove corruption, but then naturally getting Nature's Cure. So then you end up with 2 dispels on the same cooldown, which felt really weird.
Yeah, those rough edges are definitely being smoothed out as we experiment with this system.
Exactly. All right.
So speaking of hot topics,
yes.
If you thought we were going to let you off the hook, one thing we wanted to talk about was raid and party buffs. Always
Dude, the starting zone are my kind of guys, dude. They just, every question is like the kind of stuff I'm
It's a
trying to hear
controversial
about.
topic. They are returning and being expanded upon. Personally, I really approach WoW as a cooperative game, and I think that having party buffs and individual targetable buffs and raid buffs is cool. It's something that I enjoy, like having that group dynamic in. But obviously, there can be a feels bad moment when somebody is getting a buff that you're not, or they're receiving some kind of benefit that you aren't. So, like, how do you push that kind of those bonuses, those buffs into the co-op realm? How do you de-emphasize like the feels bad when you're not the one on the receiving end of it?
Yeah, that is. There's a lot to dig into there. So, hopefully we're not going to talk about Restless Crew for like the next 20 minutes. But
Did that happen already today?
No. But I mean, like, I feel like we could go down that rabbit hole. But
Okay.
it's actually really funny. We were just talking about this today, where we're talking about on classic World of Warcraft, we're in Burning Crusade, which is kind of like peak party buff meta, right? And then they're about to classic's about to transition into Wrath, where like it got pulled way back, and then here we are kind of dipping our toe back into that pool again. I think when we think about it and talk about it, there's really three categories, right? There's the raid buffs, which are like, hey, let's make sure we have a warrior who has the raid buff, or let's make sure we have a monk so that we can get the physical debuff. And when we think about it from the perspective of the past, I think making sure that, I guess I'll call it like the Tetris, right? The like building my group Tetris, the complexity can definitely get to the point where it's just too much. And not only is it too much, but like we also need to make sure that the use like silly analogy, like the juice is worth the squeeze, right? Like if we're adding that thing, it should be cool. It should be exciting. When I'm in the party with the shaman, with Wind Fury as a warrior, I am stoked. Versus, some of the other buffs that we might be experimenting right now. We need to make sure that they're really cool and fun and are, impactful. So there's the raid buffs with like party buffs versus party buffs like Wind Fury and Restless Crew, where there's definitely a line where we know exists where it is too far, and we're very early in alpha, and you can kind of expect us while we're this early to try to push as far as we can and kind of bump up against maybe where the line might be and then pull back. So that's very much where we are right now, where we're really kind of testing out to see which ones work, which ones don't. And philosophically, we understand that there's definitely a line there where the complexity gets too much. I think one of the big problems we saw with Burning Crusade was it got to the point where you felt like, well, I'm a rogue, and if I can't be in this specific party, I am way worse. Not like, oh, I don't have Wind Fury, like it might be on live right now. I'm a little bit worse, but it's not a big deal.
But like that situation is being presented on live though. So like multiple classes at the moment, not in a party with Restless Crew, are way worse than they are without it. And they feel bad about that. Classes that don't get PI feel way worse than what they have felt previously when they've gotten PI, and they feel bad about that. And also, they're not even mentioning that, like, you're talking about how rogue players feel. How do you think rogue players are going to feel when going into next expansion? In every raid comp, you have to have an assassination rogue. That buff is way too good. Arguably even better than outlaws. And then the outlaw buff is too good, so you're going to have one of those per party, assuming it won't stack, but like if it does stack, it'll just be changed or nerfed. That kind of stuff, like how do you I don't know how you balance that. Like if you're going to bring a sub rogue, which they also did give raid utility, but just a much weaker version that is already brought by other classes and not unique, being they gave them a kind of a pseudo stampeding roar. If you want to play sub, you'll be the third rogue in your group, because the other two are basically required, and people are going to feel like they have to bring them for raid buffs. So, yeah, I don't know. That's, I think Blizzard is kind of, honestly, I'm okay with, I'm not going to do my whole raid buff thing right now, but like, I think they're definitely very close on that line of like what's okay and what's not, and I would love to hear their exact opinion on bring the player, not the class, or vice versa. because they talked about how in BC it went from bring the class, not the player, into Wrath, and they pulled it back, and it was bring the player, not the class, and they had a big thing with that with Legion and BFA. But now it's like kind of getting to the point, especially with the fact that, honestly, dude, I'm cool with all these raid buffs existing if you just allow scrolls to exist for all of them, to where small 10 to 15 man AOTC communities and dungeons don't feel like shit when they don't have a specific dungeon, and you end up having people main swap to something they don't want to play, or feel like they're doing a worse job because they don't have a certain class, which is actually accurate. They're much worse. Like your entire raid can just be doing 5% less damage, or your entire raid could be taking 3% more damage, or have 5% less health. You know, like
there's definitely the tipping point where it starts to feel like, oh, well, we already have the melee group. You can't sit with us, you know. And that's definitely something that we are wary of. But we, you know, philosophically, like you said, it feels really fun to get like the PI or be in the group where you get that cool buff. So we think it's a fun design space, and we want to continue to explore it, but we're very cognizant of the, you know, the potential pitfalls there.
I like the acknowledgement of we're just going as far as we can to see where we bump up against that line, and then we'll scale it back a bit. It's alpha, you know? That's good.
Yeah, I mean, the expansion rollovers are the time where we kind of get the opportunity to really try those things that, you know, we all have talked about for, you know, 2 years or whatever it may be, while we're going through, you know, a patch cycle. And, you know, there's a degree of change when we talk about things that we want to do in World of Warcraft, where like, hey, that's a really cool idea, but like, that's an expansion kind of boundary change. That's not a change we want to make in the middle of a patch. That's like, that would just upend too much stuff. So let's put that kind of on the back burner, and when we roll around in the next expansion, let's give it a whirl. So this is very much one of those things where we kind of dipped our toe in the water with things like Wind Fury, and are now, you know, seeing what else is out there.
Cool. I mean, dipping your toe in the water with Wind Fury and then taking Restless Blades, I'm trying to think of an analogy where those two things are linked together. It's like, okay, I want to drink a water, and I've never tried water before, so I took a sip out of a glass, and that was great. So you know what I'm going to do? Put myself under an unopened dam and just open the dam and see what happens. Maybe that much water is also good if a little amount is good, right? Like that's like the difference between what Wind Fury is and what Restless Crew is potentially. Like, I mean, it's like insane.
Speaking of things that are a boundary, and we talked about this in 9.2, and it was mentioned potentially we'd get around to it at the next expansion. Maybe Master Loot, one of those things that you didn't want to play around with outside of expansion.
So this is where Ian confirmed that group loot was a thing and never said Master Loot. And then Morgan Day, I've heard someone in chat said that Morgan Day explicitly says they're not sure on Master Loot. But the thing is group loot is Master Loot. Like, it straight up is Master Loot.
Just throw that.
You could absolutely have a functional Master Loot environment currently with group loot the way that it is. It would just be kind of annoying, but I mean, it would work, and it would be better than it is now. But maybe the reason why they're doing that is, I think if you're doing group loot with the whole like need and greed thing in raid, I think you're actually going to see a lot of people choose to stay on personal instead. And then one other thing I keep mentioning, and I think it's important that people know this, is the last time that there was an option between personal loot and something else in the game, personal loot dropped more loot to compensate for the fact that it was not targeted. And if that's still the case, then you may still choose personal loot even in general.
Out there.
Didn't Ian talk about this recently? I want to say Ian talked about this recently, but it's
not to us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
True. It's very much being discussed and considered. Okay. I think specifically what we're talking about is around raid loot rules.
Yeah.
You know, we really like the way that personal loot works for a very large majority of the game, but when it comes to something as just intrinsically social, like raiding, having loot distribution be also a social function feels like something that makes sense, and we want to, you know, kind of explore further and kind of experiment there. And we'll very likely open conversations about that during Dragonflight development with the community for sure.
Great.
I want to ask something about, you know, something that strikes me about Dragonflight in a lot of ways is it feels like a back to basics expansion in some ways, in terms of investing a lot of power in your character's identity, right? Like, who is your character at a base level? What do they do? What is their purpose in the world? What is their job? And that's kind of a big sea change than we've seen since really the Legion era of the game, where there's always some kind of gradual post max level character progression, whether it's power, whether it's some other benefits in the game that are like in a little bit more indirect. From what we know about Dragonflight so far, that's not present. So I wanted to ask, like, what is a typical daily end game loop look like for a raider on an off night?
These guys get it.
In Dragonflight, I want to log into the game. I want to play WoW. I want to do something with my character. Artifact power and anima aren't really on the table. So what am I looking at? What's the benefit?
Are you
17 minutes in, 0 bad questions?
Are you saying you're going to miss artifact power? And
well, I mean, on this show, we are big artifact power fans.
Okay.
Oh,
so
God damn it!
But
Never mind.
I think there are examples of good artifact power and bad artifact power over the years
Christ.
from my perspective, right?
Totally.
But that kind of idea of like, well, if I log in, okay, maybe I don't have raid tonight, or maybe my dungeon buddies aren't around, but I can log in and do this.
Yeah, totally. So, like you mentioned with Dragonflight, a large, theme for us from a very early on, discussions with this expansion. There's this
Servers are up. Oh shit! Yo! We can come back to that later. Dragonflight Alpha interview with Morgan Day. Let's rewind it a little bit, because at this point I was like, servers are up.
Under Dragonflight, a large, theme for us from a very early on, discussions with this expansion. There's this underlying theme of like awakening, right? Like, you saw the cinematic that was super epic and came out recently, and it was all about like this flame that was being reignited and the island kind of almost like turning back on. That's very much a theme that we wanted to consistently kind of have a through line through all of the expansion, and that included our features, right? So that idea of awakening or refurbishment and kind of rebuilding upon our foundations, which in some cases are, pretty old, like with professions, they haven't really seen a big revamp in a long time. So really taking the time to revisit those core foundational systems and refurbish them such that we have a ton of design depth that we can build towards the future of. And in terms of just like, what do we plan to do if I'm a raider and I just want to log in and do some stuff? There's obviously going to be tons of the existing activities, like Mythic Plus is still out there. We're actually trying some pretty interesting experiments with Season 4 with Mythic Plus, where we're using some more legacy dungeons that are coming into the pool. A thing that we talk about a lot with Mythic Plus and that player base is when you have a new season, especially the further and further you get out from the launch of the expansion, like the mastery level of those dungeons just gets to like crazy points. And when you're trying,
yeah, but it's like, the thing is it's different though. Like okay, so how it looks like this, like if this is the time that a dungeon is out, right? Like this is the level of like mastery, right? And this is like the time that a dungeon's been out. It really is like massive like learning right off the bat, and then it's like over time, like this is a bad example, but like the mastery over time just kind of slows down. I went the wrong way. It's like this, right? But the reality is like, let's just say this is one season, right? By the end of Season 4, it is like this much higher, right? So you do get a lot better at it. But like what's way more fun is doing this right here with like more dungeons. That's why I think like their current idea is going to be so good. And I know why people are hesitant to like be excited about it, because they're like, yeah, we're not getting all 8 dragon dungeons right away. But I really think like in reality, the way you actually play Mythic Plus, this is going to be so much better for the game.
You have this reward structure that we're trying to keep a parallel kind of itemization across Mythic Plus, where people might be running the dungeon that they've run for 100 times in a new season, and they're getting really high item level stuff for it, versus someone points at Sepulchre are the first ones, where they're completely reprogressing in the raid and they're trying to figure out how to beat this cool puzzle to get the higher item level stuff. Like those two things are pretty discordant. So talking about like the dungeon pool in Mythic Plus is something we've discussed a lot, and we're experimenting with that in season 4. Like we're going to see hopefully soon how that plays out. And for people that love max level activities, I think professions is a big kind of hopefully driving hook here, right? Like we really want professions to feel like a pillar, like where it can hold up against things like PvP and Mythic Plus and raids. And there should be the same like degree of goals that you can pursue with professions. And the Outer World will be a big hook there, as well as a lot of the max level activities. I can get into some of the like, actually, what am I doing in the Outer World if you're curious about that too.
Well, kind of, because I wanted to piggyback off of that in two directions. One, just a quick hitter about dungeon stuff and the dungeon pool. How is the team feeling about the mega dungeon concept, and is that something that you plan
I was muted. Only good questions on this podcast
to explore in the future?
I definitely think it's working out pretty well, like in terms of we have this mega dungeon that is like almost like a 5-player raid. It's a great opportunity to visit and give a lot of space for some of these storylines that aren't maybe not like, I guess we'll call it like the A plot, right? Like Mechagon was not like the thing that we were all worried about at the time. Tazavesh very much has this interesting story to go along with it. So we really like that idea of almost having like a raid level space to explore with these other storylines, and then taking that dungeon, splitting it in half and introducing it into the Mythic Plus pool later feels like it's working out pretty well. There's some tweaks that we've talked about with like kind of the itemization of the mega dungeons and trying to make sure that they're appealing and something that people really want to pursue, rather than just like, these dungeons might, before they roll into the Mythic Plus pool, might not be as viable for as long as we would want them to be. So we're having some conversations around kind of the loot in them, as it were.
He did say a quick hitter. That was that was a long hitter, but yeah, I think the only thing that's weird for me, so the mega dungeons are very successful at being good dungeons in Mythic Plus when split in half, but I don't know how successful the initial release of these mega dungeons is, because it seems like you just do it like once and then the gear no longer matters, and it's also too easy because it's Mythic 0. And then it stays like that for a whole season. So it just seems like a waste, kind of. Like it would almost be like just release it as Mythic Plus, split in half, just right away, I guess would be my take. Because it just seems like you do it, and then it's just like, well, it's just here. It's like maybe that gives them extra time to like tune it for Mythic Plus, I guess. Like usually like some mechanics on these bosses are like pretty fucking wild when they first come out. But yeah, I know how the hard modes work, but Kara seemed better. I'm not sure why. Well, Karazhan is also like one of the very like best dungeon / raid concepts ever. Like it's probably, Karazhan is probably better than Mechagon, Tazavesh, and whatever else. So that's probably why it felt better. It also dropped insanely good gear, and it was worth farming it on lower. It was worth farming it with lower eye level because the pieces were so good, like Ruby. Yeah.
All right, cool. Spencer, I'll throw it to you. We got time for one more, so.
Oh, sure. Okay. Well, if we only have time for one more, I think I'm going to make it about acquiring gear, because that's something that a lot of people really have a big question on their mind.
Fucking 100% success chance of good questions asked by these people. There's no other interviewers like them, honestly, in that way. For me, like for what I care about.
When it comes to Dragonflight, are we going to see a return to of systems like the Creation Catalyst and that sort of system, as well as it's seeming like there's a lot of vendors and upgrading of gear that is already being talked about inside of the game. So is that something? Can you just expand on that a little bit more for us, as far as raid gear and things like that go? Are we seeing upgradable gear again? Are we seeing Catalyst gear again? Is that something we're going to be?
Yeah, I'll try to hit a couple different topics there. So one, yes, we were overall happy with the Creation Catalyst in terms of the goal of not only creating catch up for people who might want to have an alt or come into the patch a little late, feeling like they're not weeks and weeks away from, having their set bonus, but also just that kind of bad luck protection, as it were. There's kind of the backstop on someone who, I've only got one piece of tier set and it's been X weeks. Catalyst turns on, cool, I get my 2-piece, then shortly after that, my 4-piece. The iteration that we've talked about there is more around timing. Like I forget how many weeks in the creation catalyst opened up off the top of my head now, but there was definitely lots of posts popping up on Reddit around like, turn the thing on. So we're talking about like timing and, potentially looking at what kind of tweaks you might want to do there. But overall, we were happy with that system.
Okay, but like, did they think people were like making that shit up? Like, okay, you're like, okay, Creation Catalyst is coming out in like 8 weeks after the patch. Okay, cool. But it's like week 4 and everyone's like, fucking release it. And they weren't wrong. Like, it needed to be in the game way earlier than it was. I don't understand why they didn't just like, just rip it, unless it was like broken or something. I don't know. Creation Catalyst was an excellent system. I think it's something that you could argue should be in the game permanently if they're going to make tier in every raid. For sure. It's just something like that should exist. But just right away. It's just ridiculous to think that it shouldn't be right away.
System. Vendors, I think you're talking about like kind of a season 4, how there's a way to acquire like a set number of items in a very like, finite manner. That's something that we always like to experiment with, itemization, and especially like we mentioned, like this bad luck protection, right? Like, we all have the buddy who never got the Sylvanas daggers and was quite upset by that. And there's only like a small handful of items that usually exist like that within a certain patch. So that's definitely an area where we want to continue to explore with more deterministic ways to get, kind of to make progress towards your goals. And then also with vendors, actually a pretty big change that we're talking about.
Before he goes on, so they're actually trying this in season 4 with Dinar or whatever it's called, and you can get that currency from the raids, and then you can just pick. What'll happen in season 4 is if you guys want to pick an item, let's just say you want Old Warrior Soul and Jathis, a 2-hander, or Old Warrior Soul, the Verse Trinket off of Stone Legion Generals, and something else. I don't even know if you can get that trinket, but like you get the point, right? Like if you just want those things, you can just select them. So I think having, and I don't think you should be able to do this for all your gear, but just for a couple of raid items, allowing anyone to select whatever they want is perfectly fine. And it also removes the RNG of you never seeing a piece the entire farm period. Yeah, if you want like Old Warrior Soul and Jailer Gavel, you can do that.
I'm not sure if this has been announced. Hopefully not spoiling anything. But you might have seen like there's profession gear for PvPers. That's something that we have actually had in previous expansions, which I thought worked really well because it was a way to kind of get your, dip your toe in the water and not feel like you're going in kind of, completely under geared with all the people in there that might have honor or conquest gear on. So we wanted to create a more clear and like gradual on ramp for the PvPers. But also something we've heard a lot of feedback on is just PvP item level. We added that back in Shadowlands, and the way we introduced it was, there was just your item level and then your PvP.
Was that a success, by the way? Like, do PvPers like the fact that they have better gear now and they don't really have to get PvE gear? Sounds like big yes, but there's also some people saying no, but I don't know why they're saying no. I can't imagine why it would be bad. The problem is PvP upgrades. Oh, it's like you can only do a little at a time or something? Okay.
The item level was a certain amount higher. With Dragonflight, we've talked about,
sorry, this is a huge
for each tier of gear, so crafted, honor, conquest, pegging the PvP item level at basically the top of the band for that tier of gear, and then letting the item upgrades, which we're going to continue to carry into Dragonflight, but for PvP in particular, that would only impact the PvP item, that would only impact the PvE item level of the PvP gear. So you still want to upgrade it so that when you're out getting your professions, get loot or whatever, you're stronger in the outdoor world. But when it's time to go PvP, it should create a more even playing field there.
Consistent threshold. That's neat. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Morgan. I know that you're busy and we got to get people moving to the next thing. So thank you again.
Hell yeah. Love their interviews always.